Well, she capitalized on her brains and her great memory to kind of work her way through the state of Michigan government and eventually Capitol Hill and President Harding's election administration. Her parents were married in a central Ireland community in southwestern Ireland. It was called Shrinrone, and they came over in 1860. And she had a brother that was born someplace in New York State. And between about 1866 and 1869, her parents and her brother moved to Williamston, just outside Williamston, about 2.5 miles. And she was born in their farmhouse, which still stands today, in 1869 at the end of Glacier Road. We don't know much about her early years, as you can imagine, trying to track down an 1870s or 1880s farm girl. But her parents raised her and her brothers and sisters on a 77-acre farm, and down the way to the west, connected by a farm lane, was an uncle of hers, or her dad's brother, and they also had 77 acres of land, and that's where they had lived for about the next 30 years or so. And we don't have any record of her going to Williamston High School. We do have records back that far, but we don't see her there. But there's some indication that she went to business school in Lansing in her teens. And then we kind of pick her up when she's about 21 or 22 years old. There's a blurb in the Williamston Enterprise newspaper that says she's working kind of like in the business building department, it appears, at this, it was called The Famous. It was a kind of a general store in downtown Williamston. And within the next couple of years, she ends up relocating to Lansing and becomes hired by the Attorney General's office to be a secretary stenographer. And then she starts to meet very influential people. And by about 1902, she's in Washington, D.C., working for Connecticut Senator Oliver Platt. And during the meantime, she works for at least 3 other senators: Senator Clark of Montana, Senator Root of New York, and then eventually Albert Fall of New Mexico, which is interesting because his scandal, the Teapot Dome scandal during the Harding administration, helps bring down the Harding administration. But she was a secretary for him. So she was very, very good at what she did, and she was often called to be an expert witness on testimony that had been given in front of committees held by the United States Senate. So going through her archives at Michigan State, I know that she was on somewhat of an organizing committee for Charles Evans Hughes' 1916 Republican presidential nomination. There's a card and a little doodle artwork that he gave her to thank her for working on his campaign. So by the mid-19-teens, she was known in national GOP circles. Well, in 1920, the Front Porch Campaign was hashed by Warren Harding, and it's much different than today, where today candidates stump around the country and they have rallies and everything else. Harding decided that you were going to come to Marion, Ohio by train, by car, by horse, by walking, and you would mill around in his front yard. He'd come out and give a speech, and then you'd go on your merry way. And she was one of, and this is hard to believe running a national campaign, there were 12 people in the Elect Harding campaign headquarters, 6 males and 6 females, and she was one of the 6 females. And they worked out of Harding's house on Mount Vernon Street in Marion, Ohio, and she lived there. She eventually got her own room because, for whatever reason, her assignment, after probably about 6 weeks, if I had to guess from my research, she was assigned to Mrs. Harding, Florence Harding's personal secretary, and they would go through the mail that the hopefully first lady would get, and she would respond to some of the queries with form letters, and the ones that she thought needed a personal touch, she gave them to Mrs. Harding. She was there the night they had the national tallies announced with her sister from Lansing, and was often mentioned in the summer of 1920 as a key cog in the election campaign. When the Detroit Free Press did an expose on her during the campaign in 1920, she said that she did not meet with the reporter. He was forced to talk to people that worked with her and observed her, but she was too busy. And she had often said in personal letters in her archives that she did not want to be in the limelight at all. She wanted to be a behind-the-scenes person. So this article in the Free Press got her some notoriety. Actually, a former schoolmate from Williamston, Frank Robeson, wrote her and said, I can't believe that this girl I used to know back in Williamston is now big time with hopefully a future president. But she kept saying, I don't know why they wrote this article. Well, the reporter for the Free Press basically said she was the hardest working person on the campaign trail. She was up before everybody else and working. They're sitting around drinking coffee, talking about the sunrise, and she'd been working for 3 hours, and suggested a book should be written about her down the road because she was such an impressive person. But she really did not like the limelight. And in the 1920s, if you know your United States history, 1920 was the first election for nationwide women's suffrage, or the right to vote. So she was a high-profile person in a race that was now going to be paid attention to, not by half of the Americans, but by all of them, men and women, because they could both vote. She stayed with the campaign. He was elected, and then traveled with them on a couple of trips between November and January of 1920, and then sends in her letter of resignation, apparently unbeknownst to Mrs. Harding, because when the Hardings wanted to sell their house, because he was a senator from Ohio, to get ready to move in the White House, they told Frances, you need to come with us and help sell the house. And she'd never mentioned, apparently, that, oh, by the way, I've resigned, I don't work for you guys anymore. But she went for a week with Mrs. Harding, who she was intrigued by and impressed by with her kind of modern sensibilities as the first president's wife. So it was rumored for almost 2 months that she was going to be the First Lady's personal secretary, probably move to the White House or work out of the White House. This was a big deal. But she had resigned the campaign and had said that she really wasn't into that, in so many words. And so a couple of other names started to be floated of older women who could be the social secretary and who knew their way around Washington, D.C. And basically, by the time the swearing in took place in March, Lawler had successfully, I think in her mind, floated back into the background of politics. And Chief Justice Marshall Harlan of the U.S. Supreme Court, his daughter, Laura, was named the secretary and completed the 3 years with Mrs. Harding, and then also served the Coolidge family afterward and liked the job and wanted the job. But others basically printed that said if Lawler wanted to be the secretary, she would get it. If not, that's okay too. So that's why I'm thinking she really didn't like the limelight. And just seeing what the campaign was like in that summer probably gave her everything she needed to see about how much the press would be hounding them. And I think she was uncomfortable with that. She traveled a lot. She stayed in Washington for the bulk of her she lived like 18 more years. She spent a lot of time in Washington. It was very hard to follow her because once you kind of are not connected with the presidents and the campaign, you just kind of fade back into becoming a secretary. She became very involved in Michigan politics. She was not a suffragette. She felt that women should support the males, but she wasn't anti-women voting. She sent letters out to Michigan GOP people from Washington, D.C. about who should be, a governor and who should be this and who should be that. She felt it was important to get African-American women involved in the voting process and suggested some people in the Detroit and I believe Saginaw area that would be very good for the Republican Party. She also was on several committees, one that had to do with figuring out the wealth or the worth of a building that was going to be torn down in Washington, D.C., and there was a discrepancy of nearly like $800,000 over the worth of it. So she was on that committee. Later on, she was put on something called the Shipping Board Committee, which I tried to do some research on and fell short, unfortunately, to find out what they were doing. But she still showed up taking notes and offering input, but on things that were not what you'd find on the front pages of the newspaper. She eventually has a lifelong friendship with Senator Oliver Platt's wife from Connecticut. He had died a couple years after she had worked for him and prepared his manuscript for publication, and often went to their home in Connecticut and spent time with her. She went back to Ireland at least once and possibly twice to visit relatives back home who kind of thought she was a big deal, and I think she was. And then she would travel around the country just visiting various people she knew in politics and throughout Michigan. She would go on the Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula, and she spent a lot of time in Lansing where one of her sisters was living, and that's where she ended her last few years, splitting between Washington, D.C. and Lansing.